She was just trying to hide. The charity gala was stifling, the champagne was warm, and the last person she wanted to see had just walked through the doors with his new fiancée. Panic is a funny thing. It makes you do stupid things. So, she grabbed the arm of the nearest stranger, a man in a sharp, quiet tuxedo standing in the shadows, and whispered, "Please, just dance with me. My ex is here." She didn't know she'd just asked the most dangerous man in the city to waltz. The ballroom smelled of wilting orchids and the desperation of the upper middle class trying to impress the actual rich. Nebula Morgan stood near a melting ice sculpture, nursing a flat glass of sparkling water. She hated these events. She hated the stiff boning in her rented emerald dress, and she hated that her architectural firm required her attendants to mingle with potential clients. Mostly, she hated that she was right. He was here. Simon. He walked through the gilded double doors, looking exactly the same as he had 6 months ago when he packed his bags while she was at work. Same tailored navy suit, same practiced, easy smile. Holding his arm was a blonde woman, dripping in diamonds, that cost more than Nebula's entire mortgage. Nebula felt the air leave her lungs. It wasn't heartbreak anymore. It was the visceral, nauseating gut punch of being caught off guard. She stepped backward, trying to melt into the heavy velvet drapery lining the wall. If she could just get to the side exit, she could call a cab, go home, and scrub the evening off with cheap soap. She took another step back, and her heel caught the edge of a floor lamp. She stumbled. A hand caught her elbow. The grip was iron. There was no hesitation, no fumbling. Just a solid, warm anchor stopping her from crashing to the floor. "Careful," a voice murmured, low, unbothered. Nebula spun around, her heart knocking against her ribs. He was leaning against the wall, half swallowed by the shadows of the alcove. He wore a black tuxedo that didn't look rented, fitting him with dangerous precision. He didn't look like an architect or a banker. He looked like the man those people paid to solve their ugly problems. His dark hair was neatly parted, and his eyes, a flat, unreadable shade of slate, studied her with mild, clinical interest. Across the room, Simon laughed. The sound cut through the low jazz playing over the speakers. Nebula looked over her shoulder. Simon was turning toward the ice sculpture. He was going to see her. Panic bypassed her brain entirely. She reached out and grabbed the stranger's lapels. "Please," Nebula breathed, her voice devoid of pride. "Just dance with me. My ex is here." The stranger's brows twitched a fraction of an inch. He looked down at her hands gripping his jacket, then up to her face. He didn't ask questions. He didn't smile, but something shifted in his jaw. "All right," he said. He moved smoothly, pulling her into the current of couples moving on the edge of the dance floor. He didn't just hold her, he took possession of the space around them. His right hand flattened against her bare back, the calluses rough against the silk of her dress. His left hand swallowed hers. Nebula stiffened. He was entirely too warm, entirely too solid. "Breathe," he told her, as they swayed to the heavy rhythm of the jazz band. "I'm breathing," she lied. "You're holding your breath and you're stepping on my toes." His tone was a statement of fact. "If we're going to put on a show, you need to look like you actually want to be here." Nebula forced her shoulders to drop. Close up, he was striking in a harsh, unforgiving way. A faint, jagged scar cut through the end of his left eyebrow. He smelled like bergamot, rain, and something metallic she couldn't quite place. "Is he looking?" the stranger asked, spinning her smoothly so she faced away from the entrance. Nebula risked a glance. Simon had paused near the champagne fountain. The smug expression on his face had dissolved into a tight knot of confusion, then irritation. "Yes," Nebula whispered. The stranger's hand slid lower on her back, pulling her flush against his chest. "Good. Let him look." They danced. The ambient chatter of 100 wealthy socialites faded into a dull drone. All she could focus on was the steady rise and fall of the stranger's chest and the heavy weight of his hand guiding her. He moved with a predatory grace. Silent, efficient, taking exactly what space he needed. "You don't talk much," she noted. "I don't usually have much to say." He finally looked down at her. "Does he usually make a habit of terrorizing you in public?" "No. We haven't spoken in 6 months. He left me for his boss's daughter. It was humiliating. I just didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing me standing alone like a discarded party favor." The stranger's eyes didn't soften, but the grip on her waist tightened just a fraction. "People only have the power you give them." The music faded. Nebula stepped back, the sudden loss of his body heat making her shiver. "Thank you," she said. "I'm sorry for grabbing you. You can go back to whatever you were doing." She turned to leave, only to find herself face to face with a navy suit. "Nebula!" Simon stood there, holding 2 glasses of champagne. He looked from her to the stranger, his eyes narrowing. "I didn't expect to see you here. I thought this gala was for platinum donors." It was a quiet insult, a reminder of her place. "My firm bought a table, Simon." "Right." Simon's smile was thin. He shifted his gaze fully to the man standing behind Nebula, puffing out his chest in a pathetic display of corporate dominance. "I don't think we've met." Simon Fletcher, VP of Acquisitions at Sterling & Co. Simon held out his hand. The stranger just looked at it. He didn't take it. The silence became a physical crushing weight until Simon's smile faltered and he slowly lowered his arm. The stranger stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with Nebula. Simon looked like a boy playing dress-up. The stranger looked like the landlord arriving to collect a debt. "Gabriel," the stranger said. No last name, no title. He didn't need one. "Are you in architecture?" Simon asked, his confident brass gone. "No." Gabriel's voice was dead calm. "I deal in waste management, disposal, making sure things that are no longer useful disappear." Simon blinked, completely missing the lethal undercurrent. "Right. Well, it was good to see you, Nebula. You look, well." "She looks extraordinary," Gabriel corrected smoothly. It was a territorial boundary drawn in concrete. "Are we done here, Simon?" Simon's face flushed. He looked into Gabriel's flat slate eyes, and his instinct for self-preservation finally kicked in. "Right. Have a good evening." He turned and walked away, his posture stiff. Nebula exhaled a long, shaky breath. "Thank you, really. You didn't have to do that." He was annoying. Gabriel checked a heavy steel watch on his wrist. "Are you staying?" "God, no. I'm going to get my coat and walk to the subway." Gabriel looked at her, his gaze tracking from her rented dress to her scuffed heels. "It's raining, and it's past midnight. You aren't walking." "I'll be fine. My car is out front. I'll drop you." Nebula frowned, her cynical city instincts flaring up. "I don't even know you. I'm not getting into a car with a strange man." Gabriel let out a short, hollow sound. "If I wanted to hurt you, Nebula, you wouldn't have made it off the dance floor. Get your coat. I'm leaving in 2 minutes. You can either be in the back seat or you can get wet." He walked away before she could argue. The rain was coming down in sheets, turning the city streets into black mirrors. Nebula stood under the awning of the hotel, shivering in her thin trench coat. True to his word, a massive black SUV was idling at the curb. It wasn't a standard livery cab. It looked armored. The windows were tinted so darkly they absorbed the streetlights. A man in a dark suit, not Gabriel, stepped out of the driver's side and opened the rear door. He didn't look at her. He just held an umbrella over the gap between the awning and the car. Nebula hesitated. Every true crime podcast she had ever listened to screamed at her to walk away. But her feet were blistered. She was exhausted. And Gabriel's blunt, unbothered demeanor had strangely put her at ease. He didn't act like a creep. He acted like a man inconvenienced by a stray cat he felt obligated to feed. She ducked under the umbrella and slid into the back seat. It smelled of clean leather and that faint trace of bergamot. Gabriel was sitting on the far side, illuminated only by the passing neon lights bleeding through the wet windshield. He was looking at a tablet, his face bathed in a cold blue glow. "Address," he said, not looking up. She rattled off her intersection in Brooklyn. He tapped a finger against the privacy partition separating them from the driver. The car slid away from the curb with a heavy, silent power. For 10 minutes, the only sound was the rhythmic thud of the windshield wipers and the hiss of tires on wet asphalt. Nebula sat stiffly, acutely aware of the space between them. "You didn't have to give me a ride," she said finally, hating the silence. "I'm aware." "So why did you?" Gabriel locked the tablet and set it face down on the seat. He turned his head. In the dim light, the scar through his eyebrow looked deeper, whiter. "You asked me for a favor. I obliged. I asked you for a dance, not chauffeur service. I prefer to finish things I start. You looked like you were going to walk into traffic just to avoid that man." Nebula winced. "Was I that obvious? Only to someone paying attention. And you pay attention to a lot of things?" "It keeps me alive," he said flatly. Nebula laughed, a dry, cynical sound. "Right. Waste management. It's a dangerous gig. A lot of cutthroat competition in the garbage industry." Gabriel didn't laugh. He just stared at her. The silence stretched again, but this time it was heavy with something unspoken. Nebula felt a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the rain outside. There was a profound stillness to him. Normal people fidgeted. They tapped their fingers, adjusted their clothes, checked their phones. Gabriel did none of that. He sat perfectly motionless, conserving energy. It was a predator's trait. "What do you do, Nebula?" he asked. The use of her name startled her. It sounded different in his mouth, heavier. "I'm a junior architect at a mid-tier firm. I draw fire escapes and adjust load-bearing walls on spreadsheets all day. It's exactly as glamorous as it sounds." "You build things." "I fix things other people design poorly." Gabriel looked out the window. A useful skill. Most people just tear things down. The SUV hit a pothole, but the suspension swallowed the impact completely. They crossed the bridge into Brooklyn, the skyline of Manhattan shrinking behind them. The neighborhood grew progressively grittier. Posh high-rises gave way to brick walk-ups and neon-lit bodegas. The car slowed and pulled up to the curb outside her apartment building. The street lamp overhead was flickering, casting erratic, buzzing shadows across the wet pavement. "This is it," Nebula said, gathering her cheap clutch. She felt a sudden, weird reluctance to leave the quiet safety of the armored car. The driver got out and opened her door. The cold night air rushed in. Nebula looked back at Gabriel. "Thank you. For the dance. For dealing with Simon. For the ride." "Good night, Nebula." It was a dismissal. Clean and absolute. She stepped out into the rain, pulled her coat tight, and hurried up the steps to her building. When she fumbled her keys into the lock and pushed the heavy glass door open, she glanced back. The black SUV was still sitting there at the curb. It waited until she was safely inside the lobby, the inner door clicking shut behind her. Only then did the brake lights flare red, and the car slid soundlessly into the dark street, swallowed by the night. Nebula went up to her apartment, locked the deadbolt, and peeled off the wet trench coat. She told herself she was glad it was over. It was a bizarre, cinematic blip in an otherwise deeply ordinary life. She would go back to her spreadsheets, her stale office coffee, and her quiet, solitary routine. Gabriel was a stranger, a frightening, compelling stranger. But the city was full of them. She would never see him again. That was what she told herself. Monday morning arrived with the subtlety of a jackhammer. Nebula was at her desk by 7:30 a.m. Her office, a sprawling open-plan nightmare in Midtown, was buzzing with a frantic, caffeinated energy. Her boss, David, a man whose entire personality was built around his golf handicap and a tendency to sweat when stressed, was pacing at the front of the room. "Listen up," David barked, clapping his hands. "We just landed a whale, not a whale, a Leviathan, the Costa Development Project." A murmur went through the bullpen. Even Nebula looked up from her AutoCAD screen. Costa Development wasn't just a company. It was a shadow conglomerate. They bought up waterfront properties, leveled them, and built luxury high-rises. They paid in cash. And there were always whispers, rumors about labor unions being strong-armed, zoning boards suddenly changing their votes overnight, city inspectors looking the other way. They need a complete structural overhaul of the old shipyard down by the docks, David continued, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. They want it fast, they want it quiet, and they want our firm to handle the redesign. This is a Tier 1 priority. We pull this off, the bonuses will buy you all new cars. Nebula went back to her screen. She didn't care about cost of development. She cared about finishing the safety compliance reports for a municipal library. Morgan, David snapped, stopping by her desk. Nebula blinked. Yes? You're lead drafter on this. Nebula froze. David, I'm junior. I don't have the clearance for a commercial waterfront overhaul of that scale. Give it to Peterson. Peterson is on the Civic Center, David said, his voice dropping to a harsh, stressed whisper. And the client specifically asked for you. Nebula's blood went cold. The cheap office coffee sitting in her stomach suddenly felt like battery acid. The client asked for me by name. They sent over the contract this morning. Your name was in the stipulations. I don't know who you impressed at that gala on Friday, Morgan, but don't screw this up. The head of Costa is coming in at noon to review the preliminary site maps. Have the conference room ready. David scurried away. Nebula stared at her blank monitor, a cold dread creeping up the back of her neck. You asked me for a favor. I obliged. No, it was a coincidence. Gabriel was a common name. She didn't even know his last name. Waste management. He said he worked in waste management. Costa was real estate. It was a massive leap of paranoia to connect a man from a charity gala to a billion-dollar development firm. At 11:55 a.m., Nebula stood in the glass-walled conference room, arranging blueprints with hands that shook slightly. She smoothed her cheap navy blazer and tied her hair back. Professional. Unbothered. At exactly noon, the heavy glass doors of the firm swung open. The low hum of office chatter died instantly. It wasn't a gradual quieting. It was as if someone had pulled a plug. The silence was absolute. Nebula looked up through the glass walls of the conference room. 3 men walked in. 2 were built like freight trains, wearing dark suits that strained against their shoulders. They scanned the room with the practiced, dead-eyed efficiency of security details. Walking between them, moving with that same terrifying, silent grace he had on the dance floor, was Gabriel. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo today. He wore a charcoal 3-piece suit. He looked older in the daylight, the harsh fluorescent lights catching the sharp angles of his jaw and the jagged scar on his brow. David practically tripped over a rolling chair to get to him. Mr. Costa, welcome, welcome. We are thrilled to have you here. Gabriel didn't look at David. He didn't look at the reception desk or the terrified junior architects staring at him. His slate-grey eyes cut straight through the bullpen and locked onto Nebula, standing in the glass box of the conference room. He didn't smile, but the predatory stillness was gone, replaced by a dark, intense focus. He walked past David as if the man were a piece of furniture and opened the conference room door himself. The 2 massive men flanked the door outside, turning their backs to the glass. Gabriel stepped inside and let the door click shut behind him. The soundproofing in the room cut off the nervous shuffling of the office outside. It was just the 2 of them in the quiet. Nebula felt like a mouse that had just realized the warm, dark hole it crawled into was a snake's mouth. Gabriel, she said, her voice betraying a slight tremor. Nebula! He walked to the head of the table. He didn't sit. He rested his hands on the polished mahogany and looked at the blueprints she had laid out. I told you I prefer to finish things I start. You bought a multi-million-dollar contract with my firm just to… What? See me? The cynicism in her voice was a desperate shield against the rising panic. I bought a multi-million-dollar contract because my company needs a shipyard redesigned, Gabriel said smoothly, his eyes rising from the paper to meet hers. Requesting you as the lead was simply ensuring the money was well spent. You're a mob boss. The words fell out of her mouth before she could filter them. It was insane to say it out loud in a brightly lit corporate office. But the pieces fit too perfectly. The armored car, the silent security, the sheer, suffocating aura of fear he commanded. Gabriel tilted his head. I am a businessman, Nebula. You told me you worked in waste management. I told you I deal in making things that are no longer useful disappear. Costa Development buys useless property and builds something better. The metaphor stands. He took a slow step toward her. The air in the room felt suddenly very thin. Are you afraid of me, Nebula? Nebula swallowed hard. Her instinct, born from years of surviving a tough city on a tiny paycheck, flared. She met his eyes, refusing to step back. I'm afraid of things I can't control, and right now, you just walked in and bought my career. So yes, I'm terrified. Gabriel stopped a few feet from her. His expression softened, just a microscopic fraction. It wasn't kindness exactly. It was intrigue. Good, he murmured, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. Fear means you're paying attention. Keep paying attention, Nebula. We have a lot of work to do. He reached out, his calloused finger tracing the line of a load-bearing wall on the blueprint in front of her. But his eyes never left her face. The trap hadn't just closed. It had been built around her, steel beam by steel beam, while she was sleeping. And she had handed him the blueprints. The Costa Development shipyard was a rusted, sprawling skeleton of industrial decay on the edge of the East River. The wind coming off the water was brutal, carrying the smell of salt, diesel fumes, and damp earth. Nebula stood at the edge of a collapsed dry dock, a white hard hat clamped over her hair, her fingers numb as she clutched a clipboard. Surrounding her were 30 men in heavy work boots and reflective vests. They were rough, calloused men who spoke in shouted curses over the roar of excavators. Yet the moment Gabriel's black SUV pulled onto the gravel lot, the noise died. The excavators idled. The shouting stopped. It was a physical manifestation of power, silent and absolute. Gabriel stepped out of the vehicle. He wore a heavy charcoal overcoat, the collar turned up against the biting wind. He didn't wear a hard hat. No one asked him to. He walked through the mud and debris with the same measured, unbothered stride he used in a ballroom. 2 of his men trailed a respectful 10 paces behind. Nebula watched him approach, suppressing a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. It had been 4 days since he bought her firm's services. 4 days of drafting blueprints under the crushing weight of knowing who the client really was. You're shivering, Gabriel said. It was his greeting. No, hello. No, good morning. Just a blunt observation. It's November by the water. I'm fine, Nebula lied, tapping her pen against the clipboard. I've reviewed the western perimeter. You want to knock down the retaining wall to expand the subterranean parking. You can't. Gabriel stopped beside her, looking out over the grey, churning river. I can afford the fines, Nebula. Tear it down. It's not about city fines, Nebula snapped, her frustration overriding her fear. She pointed her pen at the decaying concrete barrier. It's physics. That wall is holding back 100 years of compacted, waterlogged soil. You pull that out without a staged reinforcement. The entire foundation of the neighboring warehouse collapses into the river. You can't bribe gravity, Gabriel. Silence hung between them, broken only by the hum of the idling machines. The foreman, a massive man named Russo, with a neck as thick as a tree trunk, stepped forward. He looked from Nebula to Gabriel, clearly expecting the boss to put the arrogant junior architect in her place. Gabriel turned his head slowly, looking down at the structural diagrams clipped to Nebula's board. Then he looked at her. Her nose was red from the cold, her eyes fierce and uncompromising. She wasn't backing down. How much time to stage the reinforcements? Gabriel asked. Russo blinked, completely caught off guard. Boss, that's going to add 3 weeks to the dig. The permits alone. I didn't ask you, Russo, Gabriel said quietly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The foreman shut his mouth so fast his teeth clicked. Gabriel returned his gaze to Nebula. How much time? 2 weeks, Nebula said, keeping her voice steady despite the adrenaline spiking in her chest. If I redesign the load distribution, we can pour concrete in sections. It's slower, but it won't drop a building on your crew. Gabriel nodded once. Do it. He unbuttoned his heavy overcoat, shrugged it off his shoulders and held it out to her. Nebula stared at the dark wool as if it were a live grenade. I don't need your coat. Take the coat, Nebula, or I will put you in the back of my car and turn the heat on until you stop rattling. Your choice. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was a logistical demand. He needed his architect functional, and right now, she was freezing. Nebula snatched the coat, ignoring the smirk on Russo's face. The wool was heavy, holding the lingering warmth of Gabriel's body and that faint, sharp scent of bergamot and ozone. It felt like wearing a weighted blanket. Better? He asked. I look ridiculous, she muttered, drowning in the massive garment. You look alive. Let's walk the eastern perimeter. For the next 2 hours, they walked the site. Nebula fired off structural concerns. Gabriel absorbed the information with chilling efficiency. He didn't question her expertise again. When she spoke, he listened. It was a bizarre dynamic. In her office, David constantly talked over her, dismissing her ideas because she was a junior. Here, amidst the mud and the mobsters, her word was treated like gospel. As they rounded the shell of an old administrative building, a rusted metal pipe, dislodged by the wind, plummeted from the scaffolding above. Nebula didn't even have time to look up. A heavy arm slammed into her chest, knocking her backward into the mud. Gabriel practically threw himself over her, just as the heavy steel pipe slammed into the concrete where she had been standing a fraction of a second before. The impact cracked the pavement, sending a shockwave through the ground. Nebula lay in the freezing mud, gasping for air, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. Gabriel was hovering over her, his hands braced on either side of her head. His eyes were wide, the flat slate color suddenly dark and fractured. Are you hit? His voice was a harsh rasp. No, Nebula choked out. No, I'm okay. Gabriel pushed himself up, pulling her to her feet in one fluid, powerful motion. He didn't let go of her arms. He inspected her face, his gaze dropping to check for blood. Finding none, the terrifying, predatory calm slammed back into place. He let go of her and turned toward the scaffolding. Russo and 3 other men were already sprinting toward them, their faces pale. Who cleared this rig? Gabriel asked. The temperature in the air seemed to drop 10 degrees. I did, boss, a younger worker stammered, pulling off his hard hat, trembling. The wind just caught the clamp, I swear to God. Gabriel stared at the boy. Nebula saw the shift in his posture, the tightening of his shoulders, the slight clench of his jaw. It was the body language of a man deciding whether or not to ruin a life. Nebula stepped forward, grabbing Gabriel's forearm. The muscle beneath his suit sleeve was coiled tight as steel cable. It was an accident, Nebula said firmly. The clamp failed. It happens on old sites. I'm fine. Gabriel looked down at her hand on his arm. Then he looked back at the terrified worker. Get off my site. If I see you on a Costa payroll again, I will break both of your legs. The boy ran. Gabriel turned to Nebula. He reached out and brushed a smear of dirt from her cheek. His thumb was calloused, the touch absurdly gentle for a man who had just threatened to cripple someone. We're done for today. Get in the car. Nebula didn't argue. She was shaking again, and this time it had absolutely nothing to do with the cold. Friday night, 9:00 p.m. Nebula was exhausted. Her bones ached. Her mind was buzzing with structural loads and concrete curing times, and she wanted nothing more than a hot shower and a cheap glass of wine. She swiped her key fob at the entrance of her Brooklyn apartment building, pushed through the heavy glass door, and stopped dead. Simon was sitting on the radiator in the lobby, scrolling through his phone. He looked up, flashing that same practiced hollow smile he used in boardrooms. Nebula, he said, standing up and brushing imaginary dust off his tailored slacks. You're working late. Nebula tightened her grip on her tote bag. How did you get in here, Simon? The outer door is locked. Someone was leaving. I just caught it. He walked toward her, projecting an easy confidence that made Nebula's skin crawl. I've been waiting for an hour. I wanted to talk. We have nothing to talk about. Go home to your fiancé. Come on, Nebula, don't be like that. Simon stopped a few feet away, lowering his voice into what he clearly thought was a persuasive, intimate register. I heard about the Costa deal. The whole industry is talking about it. A mid-tier firm snatching $1 billion waterfront development, and you're the lead drafter. The cynicism Nebula felt was a physical weight. Of course, it wasn't about closure. It wasn't about regret. It was about money. Sterling & Co. wants in on the commercial leasing rights once the build is done, Simon continued, his eyes gleaming with greedy ambition. We've been trying to get a meeting with Gabriel Costa for 6 months, but his people are impossible to bypass. I saw the way he looked at you at the gala. You have his ear. Nebula stared at him, genuinely repulsed. You ambushed me in my building so I could set up a networking meeting for you with a man you tried to humiliate. Simon scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. That was just posturing. Business is business. You owe me this much, Nebula, after the years I supported you. You supported me? Nebula's voice cracked like a whip in the empty lobby. You lived in this apartment rent-free for a year while I worked 60-hour weeks. Get out, Simon. Simon's smile vanished. His face hardened, the ugly, arrogant core of him bleeding through the corporate polish. He took a step closer, crowding her against the wall of mailboxes. Don't play hard to get. It's pathetic. You're going to give me his direct line, or I'm going to make sure my father-in-law calls David and has you pulled off this project for professional incompetence. Nebula's breath hitched. Before she could tell him to go to hell, a shadow detached itself from the dim corner of the lobby near the stairwell. You seem to have a habit of cornering women in places they can't easily escape. Simon spun around. Gabriel stepped into the dull overhead light. He wore a simple black sweater and dark jeans, but the lack of a suit did nothing to diminish the terrifying aura around him. If anything, he looked more dangerous. Stripped of the corporate veneer, he just looked like a killer. Simon paled, stumbling backward until his calves hit the radiator. Mr. Costa, I didn't know you were here. Gabriel ignored him. He looked at Nebula, his eyes tracking the distance between her and Simon, assessing the threat level. Did he touch you? No, Nebula said, her voice barely a whisper. Gabriel finally looked at Simon. He didn't yell. He walked forward with a slow, measured cadence that made Simon shrink against the peeling paint of the wall. Sterling & Co., Gabriel mused softly. Your father-in-law is Arthur Sterling, a man who built a very successful leasing firm by aggressively bullying smaller competitors. Yes, sir, Simon choked out, desperately trying to find his footing. We believe a partnership with Costa Development could be mutually... Gabriel didn't let him finish. He simply reached out and gripped the front of Simon's expensive silk tie, wrapping it around his fist once, and pulled downward. Simon gasped, forced to bend forward at an awkward, humiliating angle just to breathe. Let me explain how business works, Simon, Gabriel said, his voice dropping to a gravelly, lethal whisper. I own this city. I own the docks. I own the concrete pouring from the trucks. And as of Monday, I own 51% of Sterling & Co.'s outstanding debt. Simon's eyes bulged. He clawed weakly at Gabriel's wrist, but Gabriel's arm didn't budge a millimeter. You don't get a meeting, Gabriel continued, staring into Simon's terrified eyes. You don't get a partnership. And if you ever come within 100 yards of Nebula Morgan again, if you so much as say her name in an empty room, I won't just ruin your company. I will make sure they never find the pieces of you. Do we have a deal? Simon couldn't speak. He just nodded frantically, tears of absolute panic welling in his eyes. Gabriel uncoiled his fist and shoved Simon backward. Simon hit the wall hard, gasping for air. Run, Gabriel told him. Simon scrambled past them, slamming his shoulder into the heavy glass door in his haste to get out into the night. The lobby fell dead silent. The faint hiss of the radiator was the only sound left. Nebula stood frozen against the mailboxes. She looked at Gabriel, at the relaxed set of his shoulders, at the complete lack of elevated breathing. He had just threatened to murder a man, and his heart rate hadn't even ticked up. He turned to her, his slate eyes softening slightly as he took in her pale face. Why are you here? She asked, her voice shaking. How did you even get inside? I own the building, Nebula. Gabriel said simply. I bought it 3 days ago. Nebula's stomach dropped. The illusion of her quiet, separate life shattered completely. She wasn't just working for him. He was building a cage around her, buying up the very ground she stood on. You can't do that, she breathed, panic rising in her throat. Gabriel closed the distance between them. He didn't touch her, but his proximity was a heavy, inescapable weight. He looked down at her, the cynical, ruthless Mafia boss entirely exposed. I already did, he said. You bought my building. Nebula repeated the words slowly, trying to find the logic in them. The radiator hissed in the corner of the lobby, a harsh metallic sound that filled the heavy silence. Gabriel stood there, entirely unapologetic. The lock on the front door was a joke, Nebula. The fire escape in the alley is rusted through, and your landlord was 3 months behind on property taxes. It was a bad investment for him. It's a secure one for me. It's my home, she fired back, the tremor in her voice giving way to a sharp, rising anger. You don't get to just buy my life because you have the cash. I am not a piece of waterfront property. I am not a project you can optimize. Gabriel didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice to match hers. He just watched her with that unnerving, predatory stillness. Simon walked right in. He was waiting for you in the dark. If that had been someone from the docks, someone who wanted to send me a message by hurting my lead architect, you would already be gone. I survived 28 years in this city without you managing my perimeter, and you survived Friday night because I stepped in. Gabriel closed the distance between them, stopping just a breath away. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a physical weight pressing down on her chest. I deal in risk, Nebula. I eliminate it. You are a vulnerability I cannot afford right now. Nebula stared up at him. She wanted to scream. She wanted to slap the arrogant clinical detachment right off his face. But beneath the anger, a terrifying realization bloomed in her chest. He wasn't doing this to cage her. He was doing this because he didn't know how to protect something without owning it. His entire world was built on leverage and territory. She was just the newest territory. I won't be your pet bird, she whispered, her voice tight. I won't live in a velvet cage, Gabriel, a muscle feathered in his jaw. The flat slate grey of his eyes darkened, fracturing into something violently human. He reached out, his knuckles brushing the line of her jaw. His skin was rough, radiating a heat that made her breath catch. It's not a cage, he murmured, his thumb dragging lightly over her cheekbone. It's a fortress. There is a difference. Only depending on which side of the lock you're standing on. Gabriel let his hand drop. He took a step back, giving her the air she desperately needed. Tomorrow morning, a crew is coming to replace the lobby doors. They will fix the fire escape. They won't bother you. I will step back, if that is what you want. It was a concession. From a man who never conceded anything. Nebula gripped the strap of her tote bag, her knuckles white. I want to do my job. I want to build the shipyard. And I want to go home to an apartment that I pay rent for, to my actual landlord. You pay rent to a shell corporation now, Gabriel said flatly. I won't apologize for keeping you breathing. Good night, Nebula. He turned and walked out the glass doors. He didn't look back. Nebula stood in the lobby for a long time, listening to the rain start to fall against the street, feeling the ghost of his calloused thumb on her skin. She had drawn a line in the sand. She just didn't realize the tide was already coming in. For the next 2 weeks, Gabriel kept his word. It was infuriating. He was at the shipyard every day, a silent, brooding anchor amidst the chaos of the construction. He reviewed her updated blueprints, authorized the reinforcements for the retaining wall, and handled the foreman with his usual quiet terror. But he treated Nebula with a sterile, professional distance. He didn't offer her his coat when the wind howled off the river. He didn't stand close enough for her to smell the bergamot. He was giving her exactly what she asked for, autonomy, and she hated it. She hated that she looked for his black SUV every morning. She hated that her drafting pencil paused when she heard the low, gravelly timbre of his voice across the mudlots. The cynicism that had protected her for years was failing, eroded by the sheer, undeniable gravity of the man. He was a monster to the world, but to her, he had been nothing but a shield. The break in the tension didn't come in the rain or on the docks. It came in a cramped, dimly lit Italian restaurant in Queens. It was a Tuesday evening. They had just finished a grueling 4-hour municipal zoning board meeting. Gabriel had paid off the right commissioners, Nebula had presented the structural stress tests, and the permits were stamped. As they walked out of the municipal building, Gabriel had simply opened the rear door of his SUV and said, "You need to eat." She hadn't argued. The restaurant was empty, save for an old man reading a newspaper at the bar. The owner, a balding man with flour on his apron, had taken one look at Gabriel, locked the front door, and flipped the sign to closed. They were seated in a back booth, a bottle of heavy red wine bleeding into the cheap crystal glasses between them. "You played the zoning commissioner perfectly," Gabriel said, leaning back against the red vinyl. He had taken his tie off, his collar unbuttoned. He looked tired. It was the first time Nebula had ever seen him look anything less than invincible. "I just gave him the math," Nebula said, swirling the wine in her glass. "You gave him an ego stroke. You let him think he found the loophole in the parking structure when you deliberately left it open for him to find." Gabriel took a slow sip of his wine. "It was manipulative. I was impressed." Nebula offered a dry half-smile. "I learned from watching you." The air between them shifted, thickening with the unspoken words they had swallowed over the past 2 weeks. Gabriel set his glass down. He looked at her, his eyes tracing the curve of her neck, the exhausted slump of her shoulders. Before he could speak, the heavy wooden door at the back of the restaurant, the kitchen entrance, swung open. A man walked out. He wasn't one of the cooks. He wore a camel hair coat over a sharp grey suit. He had a silver fox smile and eyes like dead black glass. 2 massive enforcers flanked him, their hands resting loosely near their waistbands. Gabriel didn't move. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't even shift his weight. But the temperature in the booth plummeted. The tired businessman vanished, and the apex predator returned, silent and coiled. "Gabriel!" the man said, pulling up a wooden chair and scraping it backward across the tile floor to sit at the end of their booth. "They told me you were dining out tonight. I hope I'm not interrupting." "You are, Moretti," Gabriel said. His voice was a flat, dead line. "And I don't like being interrupted when I eat." Moretti smiled, showing too many teeth. "It's a quick conversation. Just a friendly check-in. The docks are looking busy, a lot of concrete pouring, a lot of money moving around." He glanced at Nebula, his eyes lingering on her a second too long. "And you have a very pretty new architect drawing the lines. It would be a shame if something destabilized the project." Nebula's stomach clamped into a cold knot. It was a threat. Barely veiled, dripping with intent. She remembered the steel pipe plummeting from the scaffolding. The clamp failed. "My projects are stable, Moretti," Gabriel said softly. "Grand shifts," Moretti countered, leaning forward, resting his forearms on the table. "Unions strike. Materials catch fire. It's a volatile city, Gabriel. I just think my family could offer some oversight. For a percentage, of course. Say, 20% of the commercial leasing." Extortion. Nebula watched the play of power, the invisible, suffocating tension between the 2 men. Gabriel's right hand was resting on the table. His fingers were completely relaxed. "I don't need partners," Gabriel said. "Everyone needs partners, Gabriel. Otherwise, things tend to collapse under their own weight." Moretti looked at Nebula again. This time, it wasn't just a glance. It was an appraisal. A predator sizing up a weak point. "Isn't that right, sweetheart? You're the architect. You know what happens when too much pressure is applied to a weak foundation." The silence in the restaurant was absolute. Even the owner in the kitchen had stopped moving. Gabriel's eyes went completely black. He inhaled, a slow, calculated breath. He was going to kill him. Nebula could feel it radiating off his skin. He was going to pull a weapon and end it right here, over a plate of cold pasta. She didn't think. She just acted. Nebula leaned forward, setting her wineglass down with a sharp clink that shattered the silence. She looked Moretti dead in the eyes. "Actually, Nebula said, her voice entirely devoid of a tremor. You're misunderstanding the structural model. Moretti blinked, taken aback by the civilian speaking up. Excuse me? The foundation isn't weak, Nebula said, holding his dead glass stare. It's built on bedrock. We've driven steel pilings 80 feet into the earth. The problem with applying external pressure to a reinforced structure isn't that the structure breaks. She leaned a fraction closer. It's that the force reflects backward. The thing applying the pressure is the thing that shatters. It's basic physics. Moretti's smile faltered. He looked from Nebula to Gabriel. Gabriel was staring at Nebula. The lethal, coiled anger in his face had been entirely replaced by a look of profound, staggering shock. And beneath the shock, a dark, consuming pride. Moretti cleared his throat, pushing his chair back. This dynamic had shifted. He hadn't found a weak point. He had found a second gun pointed at his head. Well, physics. I was never much for science. We'll talk soon, Gabriel. No, we won't, Gabriel said, his eyes never leaving Nebula's face. Moretti and his men left through the back door. The heavy lock clicked shut behind them. Nebula exhaled, a long, shaky breath, her adrenaline crashing hard. Her hands began to tremble. She hid them under the table. I shouldn't have said anything. I'm sorry. Don't. Gabriel slid out of his side of the booth and into hers. He crowded her into the corner, his thigh pressing heavily against hers. The sterile distance he had kept for 2 weeks was gone, incinerated in the span of 30 seconds. He reached under the table and took her trembling hands in his. His grip was an anchor, heavy and grounding. You didn't need to do that, he murmured, his face inches from hers. He was threatening you. He was looking at me like I was leverage to use against you. You are leverage, Gabriel said, his voice dropping to a harsh, raw whisper. You are the only leverage anyone in this city has over me, Nebula. And you just sat there and told a man who bodies people in oil drums that you would shatter him. I was talking about concrete. You were talking about me. Gabriel's hand slid from her fingers, trailing up her arm, his palm flattening against the side of her neck. He felt her pulse, racing wildly under his touch. I tried to step back. I tried to give you your safe, quiet life, but you just walked right back into the fire. I don't want safe, Nebula breathed, the truth of it finally tearing through her cynical defenses. She looked up into his scarred, ruthless face. Safe is Simon. Safe is a flat apartment and a dead-end job. You're terrifying, Gabriel. But you're the only real thing in my life. Gabriel let out a ragged breath. The restraint snapped. He kissed her. It wasn't a gentle testing thing. It was a collision. It was the desperate, crushing weight of a man who spent his life in the dark, finally touching a live wire. His mouth was hot, demanding, his hand tangling in her hair to hold her in place as he consumed the space between them. Nebula gasped into his mouth, her hands gripping the lapels of his suit, pulling him closer. She tasted the heavy red wine and the sharp, violent edge of the world he lived in. And God help her, she wanted more of it. She kissed him back with a fierce, reckless desperation, matching his rhythm, surrendering to the velvet cage she had finally chosen to lock herself inside. Waking up with a criminal empire in your bed was remarkably quiet. Nebula opened her eyes to the dim grey light filtering through the blinds of her Brooklyn apartment. The heavy, warm weight of Gabriel's arm was draped across her waist. He was already awake. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, his breathing slow and even. In the pale morning light, the jagged scar on his brow looked silver. She didn't move. She just watched him, the cynical, survivalist part of her brain, the part that had kept her going through a bad breakup and years of grueling, thankless work, was screaming that this was a mistake. You don't invite a shark into a swimming pool and expect to just do laps. But as Gabriel turned his head and looked at her, his slate eyes stripping away the last of her defenses, the screaming stopped. You're overthinking, he rasped, his voice rough with sleep. I'm calculating load distributions. Nebula lied, pulling the blanket up a fraction. Gabriel's mouth twitched. It wasn't a smile, but it was close. He rolled onto his side, propping himself up on one elbow, and traced the line of her collarbone with a calloused thumb. We can stop. I can walk out that door, put a detail on this building, and you can go back to drawing fire escapes. You already asked me that, she said quietly. My answer hasn't changed. It might. After today, the shift in his tone was immediate. The warmth drained out of the room, replaced by the sterile, predatory focus that governed his life. Gabriel sat up, throwing the sheets aside. His back was a map of old violence, faded knife scars, the puckered hollow of a bullet wound near his left shoulder blade. What happens today? Nebula asked, sitting up and pulling the sheet to her chest. Gabriel reached for his dress shirt. Moretti wasn't just posturing at the restaurant. He moved a dozen of his men into the warehouse district last night. He's going to make a play for the shipyard. If he shuts down the concrete pour today, the foundation sets unevenly. The structural integrity fails. It costs me $50 million in delays and makes me look weak to the families. Nebula felt the blood drain from her face. You're going into a gunfight. I'm going to work, Gabriel corrected, buttoning his shirt with mechanical precision. You are staying here. I have 3 men outside your door. No! The word left her mouth before she could think better of it. Gabriel paused, his hands resting on his collar. He looked at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. Excuse me, I'm the lead architect, Gabriel. Nebula threw off the sheets and grabbed her jeans from the floor. The pour for the subterranean retaining wall happens in stages. If you just halt it, or if your men scatter the crew, the cold joint will fracture when the soil settles. You need me there to monitor the load sensors and dictate the section breaks. If I stay here, your $50 million foundation turns to dust anyway. Gabriel stared at her. He looked at the stubborn set of her jaw, the defiant spark in her eyes. For a long, terrifying second, Nebula thought he might actually lock her in a closet. Instead, he let out a short, hollow exhale. Get dressed. Keep your head down. If I tell you to get in the car, you get in the car. No arguments. By 8 a.m., the shipyard was a hive of controlled chaos. The sky was the color of bruised iron, spitting freezing rain onto the mud. Cement mixers idled in a line, their massive barrels turning with a deafening rhythmic grind. Nebula stood in the command trailer on the edge of the pit, staring at the digital readouts from the pressure sensors embedded in the earth. The numbers were holding steady. Gabriel was outside, standing by the perimeter fence. He had traded his tailored suit for a heavy tactical jacket. His men were fanned out, their posture rigid, hands resting inside their coats. The tension in the air was thicker than the wet concrete pouring into the steel rebar grids 50 feet below. At 9:15 a.m., the first truck exploded. The sound was a physical blow. It wasn't like the movies. There was no massive fireball, just a concussive, deafening crack that rattled the teeth in Nebula's skull. The front tire of the lead cement mixer blew out, showering the crew in shredded rubber and metal shrapnel. Panic erupted. The crew scrambled, dropping their tools and diving into the mud. Gunfire followed. It didn't sound like cannons. It sounded like dry branches snapping rapidly in the cold air. Pop, pop, pop. Nebula hit the floor of the trailer instinctively, her hands covering her head. Through the thin aluminum walls, she heard men shouting. She heard the agonizing grind of metal as the crippled cement truck lurched sideways, its massive weight shifting dangerously toward the lip of the foundation pit. The truck! It was Russo's voice, screaming over the gunfire. Nebula crawled to the window of the trailer and pulled herself up just enough to look over the sill. The hitmen had breached the western gate. 6 men in dark coats were advancing, firing methodically at Gabriel's crew. But Gabriel's men were already moving, a synchronized, lethal counterattack. Gabriel was in the center of it. He moved with a terrifying economy of motion. He didn't seek cover. He walked forward, his weapon raised, firing with a cold, mechanical rhythm. 2 of Moretti's men dropped into the mud before they even registered he was there. But Nebula wasn't watching the gunfight. Her eyes were locked on the crippled cement truck. It was sliding. The wet mud on the embankment was giving way under the 40-ton weight of the tilted machine. If that truck went over the edge, it would crash directly into the primary load-bearing strut of the retaining wall. The strut wasn't cured yet. It would snap. The river wall would collapse, flooding the entire subterranean level and drowning the 4 workers currently trapped at the bottom of the pit. Physics didn't care about mob wars. Nebula didn't think. The paralyzing fear that should have kept her pinned to the floor simply vanished, replaced by the cold, hard clarity of mathematics. She kicked open the trailer door and sprinted into the freezing rain. "Nebula, get down!" Gabriel's roar cut through the chaos, raw and desperate. A bullet sparked against the side of a backhoe a few feet from her, pinging off into the mud. Nebula ignored it. She ignored Gabriel. She was staring at the steel cables holding the heavy excavation crane 50 yards away. She sprinted across the slippery, churned earth, her boots sinking ankle-deep in the muck. She reached Russo, who was huddled behind a stack of steel I-beams, clutching a radio. "The crane!" Nebula screamed over the noise, grabbing the massive foreman by the collar of his jacket. "Swing the crane arm over the truck. Drop the magnetic winch." Russo stared at her like she was out of her mind. "We're taking fire, lady!" "The operator ran!" Nebula swore, a sharp, ugly word. She shoved past him, scrambling up the metal ladder of the crane's cab. Her hands were numb, slick with freezing rain, slipping on the rungs. She hauled herself into the operator's seat. She had never driven a heavy crane, but she had drafted the schematics for hundreds of them. Hydraulics, counterweights, levers. Through the reinforced glass of the cab, she saw Moretti's men falling back. Gabriel was a phantom in the smoke and rain, relentless and precise. The gunfight was ending. But the truck was moving faster now. A sickening groan of shifting mud echoed across the pit. The back tires slid over the lip of the drop. Nebula slammed her hand onto the ignition button. The massive diesel engine roared to life, vibrating through her chest. She grabbed the right joystick, throwing it forward. The heavy steel arm of the crane swung wildly, tearing through the air. She overcorrected, pulling back, dropping the heavy magnetic winch block directly over the cab of the sliding cement truck. "Hit the lock!" she screamed to no one, slamming the magnetic engage button on the console. With a deafening clang, the massive electromagnet seized the steel chassis of the truck. Nebula pulled the left lever back with everything she had. The crane's engine screamed in protest, black smoke billowing from the exhaust. The treads bit into the mud, slipping, grinding, fighting against 40 tons of dead weight and gravity. For a terrifying second, the crane tipped forward. The back treads lifted off the ground. Nebula was going to be dragged into the pit with it. Then, the counterweights caught. The truck stopped. Halfway over the edge, suspended over the fragile retaining wall by the screaming cables of the crane. The mud settled. The gunfire stopped. The only sound left was the roar of the diesel engine and the heavy, rhythmic thumping of the cement mixer, still turning on its ruined chassis. Nebula let go of the levers. Her hands were shaking so violently she couldn't open her fingers. She sat in the cab, gasping for air, staring down at the disaster she had just halted by inches. The cab door wrenched open. Gabriel stood on the ladder. He had blood on his face, a streak of crimson cutting across his cheekbone. His eyes were wide, feral, completely stripped of their usual flat control. He looked at her shaking hands, at the massive truck suspended over the abyss. He didn't say a word. He just reached in, grabbed her by the waist, and pulled her out of the seat. He carried her down the ladder and set her on the solid ground behind the machine. Then he pinned her against the cold steel of the treads, wrapping his arms around her so tightly it knocked the remaining breath from her lungs. He buried his face in her wet hair, his chest heaving against hers. "Are you hit?" he demanded, his voice a ragged, broken growl. His hands were frantically checking her arms, her back, terrified of finding blood. "I'm fine," Nebula gasped, clutching his tactical jacket. "I'm fine, Gabriel. The truck." "Fuck the truck!" he swore, his voice trembling with a violence born entirely of fear. He pulled back, gripping her face in his hands. His thumbs wiped the freezing rain from her cheeks. I told you to stay in the trailer. I told you to get down. You ran straight into a firing line. The strut would have failed, Nebula said, her voice finally steadying. She looked up into his fractured, terrified eyes, feeling a strange, profound calm settling over her. The wall would have collapsed. I couldn't let it fall, Gabriel. Gabriel stared at her. The feral panic in his eyes slowly receded, replaced by an overwhelming, staggering awe. He was looking at her not as a civilian he had to protect, but as an equal who had just walked through his fire and refused to burn. He rested his forehead against hers, closing his eyes. Moretti is dead. It's over. And the Foundation? Gabriel let out a wet, exhausted laugh. It was a beautiful sound. The Foundation holds, Nebula. Because of you. 6 months later. The summer sun beat down on the completed Costa Development shipyard. It was a masterpiece of steel and glass, rising from the edge of the river like a monument to ambition. The retaining walls were flawless. The structural integrity was absolute. Nebula stood on the top floor of the central high-rise, looking out through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the Manhattan skyline. She wore a sharp, tailored white suit. She wasn't a junior architect anymore. She was a partner. The heavy glass door behind her clicked open. Gabriel walked in. He looked exactly the same, a dark, perfectly cut suit, moving with that silent, predatory grace. He came to stand behind her, sliding his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. The final inspection passed, Gabriel murmured, resting his chin on her shoulder. Not a single flaw. The city inspectors were terrified to find one, but they didn't have to lie. Of course there aren't any flaws, Nebula said, leaning into his warmth. I built it. Gabriel turned her around, his hands resting on her hips. He looked down at her, his slate eyes warm and heavily possessive. The scars on his face were a testament to the brutal world he ruled, but the way he touched her was entirely reverent. You built a fortress, he corrected softly. No. Nebula smiled, reaching up to trace the scar through his eyebrow. She had accepted the danger. She had accepted the blood, the fear, and the leverage. She had taken the dark, heavy weight of his world and designed something unbreakable around it. We built a home. He kissed her, a deep, consuming promise, high above the city that belonged to them. If this story hooked you, don't leave just yet. The descent into Gabriel Costa's dark, dangerous world is just beginning, and Nebula is about to realize that dancing with the devil comes with a heavy price. Will she survive the criminal empire she's been dragged into, or will she become its newest architect? Hit that like button if you want to see part 4, share this video with fellow Mafia romance addicts, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single chapter of this thrilling, grounded romance.